Starting in the early 1960s, American K-12 education was transformed from focusing on facts and knowledge to using techniques from behavioral psychology, Pavlov and B.F. Skinner, to socialize students. So-called new math was introduced, leading to criticism by top mathematicians, parents, and many educators, and phonics was replaced by whole word reading instruction. These changes resulted in a decade-long decline in standardized test scores, from which we have never recovered. The 1973 book, Why Johnny Can't Read, and the 1983 groundbreaking report by the federal government, A Nation at Risk, kicked off initiatives at every level of government to try to fix education. Federal spending and involvement in education continued to rise, kept by the 2001 No Child Left Behind Act. This act required the states to develop high-stakes tests for their students and imposed ratings and punishments for schools that did not keep up. Teachers and parents bitterly complained that these high-stakes tests resulted in teachers teaching to the test. After the 2007-2008 financial crash, $50 billion in federal stimulus funds were used to push states to implement detailed databases to track and analyze our children.
There's a student enrollment information on graduates, transfers, and dropouts, state assessment scores, information on students not tested. Perhaps your children are homeschooled, perhaps they go to a private school. Finance records and health records are included in the data system. Now, how many kindergartners do you think have financial records?
And later, Race to the Top funding was used to convince 45 of 50 states to implement the new Common Core state standards. Common Core has been implemented virtually in secret, yet parents, legislators, and many teachers have risen up to oppose Common Core. Both the New York State and Chicago teachers' unions have voted against Common Core.
Common Core!
Join Ann Marie Banfield, Education Liaison of Cornerstone in New Hampshire, as she leads our 5-session series with Jamie Gass, Director of School Reform at the Pioneer Institute, Dr. Sandra Stotsky, Professor Emerita at the University of Arkansas, Sid Glassner, Senior Fellow at the New England Institute for the Study of Education, and Dr. James Milgram, Professor Emeritus in Mathematics at Stanford University.
So now as we start our second show, we're going to go over the Common Core math standards and what are the problems with them and things like that. We're going to bring in Dr. James Milgram, his bio you can check on the website for. But what I'm going to start with is I'm going to go to Jamie from the Pioneer Institute. He was in our first session, and by the way, if you haven't seen that first session, go back and watch that first one. It's on the general overview of Common Core. But I want to go to Jamie first and kind of ask him about the research that Pioneer did on validating these standards, and then we'll go directly to Dr. Milgram.
So Pioneer Institute is an independent think tank and research organization from Massachusetts. And as the Common Core discussion began to unfold, primarily in Massachusetts in 2010, we decided that given the fact that Massachusetts had among the best standards in the country, that it would be a good idea to take a look at the quality of academic standards that Common Core offered against other high standard states like Massachusetts and California. So we enlisted Dr. Sandra Stotsky, Zev Werman, a Silicon Valley engineer, but also Professor Milgram from Stanford University, who had worked on the very high-quality mathematics standards in California. And they looked at various drafts of Common Core against these high-standard states. And Dr. Milgram can certainly talk about it in a lot more. But they found a lot of deficiencies. And then just most recently, this past fall, Dr. Milgram, as well as Dr. Stotsky, co-authored a paper on STEM weaknesses of Common Core. So that really has been our point of interest and contact on the topic. We wanted to find out how Common Core stacks up against the best standards in the country. Okay, so Dr. Milgram is joining us with Skype, and
I think that we just need to jump right in and ask you, okay, so you are a member of the validation committee, and we kind of went through that in our first segment, you know, who sat on these committees, so we've kind of gone through that, but you refused to sign off on the Common Core math standards. Can you kind of give us an overview as to why, and maybe some of your background in developing other state standards, and why weren't these good enough for your stamp of approval?
Well, you know, we were supposed to sign a very specific document that said these standards are comparable to the highest level standards in the world, and that they were, you know, error-free and you know, and just generally very high quality. And the trouble was, while these standards, in my estimation, were better than roughly 90% of the state standards that existed at that time, they were far below the remaining 10%, that is 5 states, that in particular California, Massachusetts, Indiana, Michigan, and what would be the fourth?
Texas.
Minnesota. And so I couldn't sign off on them because I was being asked to say that they were better than these standards, which they weren't, and that they were better than or at least comparable to the standards, the international standards, that are the standards pretty much uniformly used in the high-achieving countries. But it didn't work, because it wasn't true, because those standards in the high-achieving countries were fully 2 years ahead of what was going on in Common Core by the time students were in 7th or 8th grade. And they were at least 1 year behind what had been done both in California and Massachusetts. And I would comment on the others, but I'm not all that familiar with the Indiana standards. So it just wasn't. It wouldn't have been true. I would have been lying, and so I couldn't sign off on them.
Okay, and I thank you for that honest response, because I think it's helping a lot of parents out here and a lot of people like me understand that, you know, that there are significant problems with these standards. So I'm wondering, can you kind of go over, I think from a parent's point of view, what are the flaws? Like, can you kind of go through? I know that I've heard you talk about the STEM. You know, that the inability to really prepare students for STEM. Can you kind of go over, like, the K through 12? What should parents be concerned about? And I know that, you know, you can't go into every detail of every, you know, little mathematical concept. But in a general view, can you just kind of go through and point to the flaws, the big flaws that jump out at you?
I can try. I think the largest issue initially that I was upset about was something that I wasn't even considering when I made the decision that as a member of the validation committee I couldn't sign off on them. I was looking at that point strictly at K through 8, and you know, and the situation was problematic at best in K through 8, but later. Indeed, more recently, just a year or two, for the last year or two, I became aware of what had actually happened in 9 through 12 in the high school level material, and it was appalling. And you know, it would have been. I would never even have said that the standards are better than 90% of the state standards out there if I had the time. It was a very rushed process in validation. We started in September of 2009. We finished in May of 2010, and it just wasn't near the amount of time that one needs to do a proper job. And you know, in particular, I didn't look at beyond the initial drafts what was going on in high school. And here's what it turned out to be. That the initial draft of the Common Core only went through Algebra 1 and then stopped. Now, in California and in Massachusetts, that's 8th grade material. And you know, that was at one point where I actually intervened, and I said that I couldn't accept just going through Algebra 1, but it was amazingly hard for me to get through to them that they had to include more. And so in the end, they had the Algebra 1, and then they added geometry, and then they added some Algebra 2. But I couldn't get any more than that. And now if you look at the data on graduation, on graduation rates from the high schools, when the student's highest course is Algebra 1, the highest course that they took, then there is a 7% chance that they will get a bachelor's degree in any subject. And if their highest class is geometry, then there's a 15% chance they will get a bachelor's degree in some subject. And finally, if the highest course they take is Algebra 2, then there's a 33 to 35% chance that they will get a degree in college, and I mean any degree. Now, when you look at that data and you say, what happens with students getting STEM degrees, STEM being, what is this, science, engineering,
Technology and math, yes.
Technology, engineering, and mathematics. When you look at those areas, the actual data, even on Algebra 2, is 2%. 2% of the students who intend to go into STEM majors, whose highest course in high school in mathematics was Algebra 2, only 2% of those students who intend for a STEM degree will ever get one. And that's characteristic of what Common Core turned out to be really all about. When we looked more closely at the evaluation by the writing team, that consisted, the lead writers on this were 3 people, Mr. Phil Darrow, Dr. William McCullum, and Dr. Jason Zimba. The last 2 have their degrees in mathematics. The first one has his bachelor's degree in English, and if he has a master's, it's in education. These were the members of the writing team, and in 2010, the last 2, McCullum and Zimba, were very explicit in their view of where things stood. And what they said was that the Common Core was designed for students who intended to enter a community college or a non-selective university, so a university like University of Phoenix or something like that.
Okay. Can I just jump in real quick?
Sure.
Because I want to ask you something. I'm hearing a lot, and I want to get your opinion on this. I'm hearing a lot from licensed child psychologists and teachers across the country who are saying that these standards are not developmentally appropriate for children. Is that something that you're hearing? Would you agree? Is that something? What is your opinion on that?
Okay, there is no question in kindergarten, 1st grade, and half of 2nd grade, these standards are actually extremely difficult. They are more difficult in crucial ways than are the standards in the high-achieving countries. There is no question in my mind and in the minds of a lot of developmental psychologists that in those 3 years, the standards are flatly inappropriate. They call it developmentally inappropriate. The way I would interpret it in more plain English is that students who are in the normal course of development and are taking and trying to learn this material are simply too young to learn it, the material the Common Core asks them to learn in those grades. So in those grades, there's absolutely no question about this. But as I indicated, when we get to high school, things suddenly become, essentially almost simple-minded, and there's a continuous, diminishing of the level at which they're appearing, starting in the middle of second grade. So by the time you're in third grade, it's fairly safe to say that that at that point they are appropriate. By the time you're in fifth grade, they're actually behind where the normal student development would allow students to be. And as I indicated again, by the time you're in eighth grade, they're fully 2 years behind normal development by typical students. Now remember, the high-achieving countries are countries that contain about 3 billion people. And when you have that data set, you look at that data set and you say, look, then that's the normal person, what the people in these countries are. And remembering that 90% of them graduate from high school, and for most of the high schools in those countries, calculus is a graduation requirement. So the level at which these people are is what all people should be able to reach. And we are nowhere close to that. Already by 8th grade, if you follow Common Core strictly, you can never take calculus in high school, ever.
Wow, okay, so, because I think I actually had somebody ask me that one time, because they said, well, if these are dumbed down standards, then how can they be so difficult for kids? And I think what you've done is you've kind of explained, and I think what parents need to do is they need to look at their, when they have little kids, if they're having difficulty figuring out the homework, the parent, then think about this as a child. And we've seen it. There's a Facebook page called Inappropriate Common Core. And so parents put example after example of math problems and worksheets that their kids are bringing home. And you're looking at this and you're going, okay, I don't even understand this as an adult. It doesn't make sense. And these are little kids. And then basically what you're saying is, but they're still kind of dumbed down standards, because by the time they get to 5th grade and 8th grade, they're actually behind their peers in the top performing countries. This sounds like a big mess. What are you hearing are you hearing anything from teachers, from parents? I guess, what are you seeing? Because, you looked at the standards, and now that they're actually being implemented, is this a bigger mess than you envisioned it would be, or did you expect this to kind of happen? Go ahead.
No, it's a bigger mess, and it's a mess in a direction that I really never expected. I think to explain that, I need to give you a little bit of history. See, in California, we had standards very, very much like this back in 1986 and 1992. And by about 1992-93, there was a rebellion going on in California, because the parents couldn't see the point of what these kids were learning. And you say, for example, where I am in Silicon Valley, the parents were highly math educated. I mean, they're engineers and they're computer scientists, and they're in related areas. And these parents are knowledgeable, and they're looking at what their kids are learning, and they're saying this has no relation to anything. And unfortunately, as a mathematician, I can tell you, and I did tell them, they're absolutely right, and if you feel that way, you're absolutely right. The mathematics that was being learned in California then, and the mathematics that is being interpreted as what Common Core tells the schools to do, is material that is not of any real use if you're going into more serious areas. So it's just weird. I tend to call it bizarre. The whole situation, everything that's involved in it, is just bizarre. It's the thing we saw 20 years ago. We had the math wars, at least in California, stopped this kind of development until now. but now it's all back, and everything I'm hearing I heard then. There's no difference between what parents are saying now and what they said in California 20 years ago, and also in Massachusetts. So what you're doing, it's this kind of deja vu all over again, and hopefully, very hopefully, what happened in California will happen here before the damage to the kids is irreversible. That there will be damage. Unfortunately, there's nothing you can do about that, but parents who can will tutor. Hopefully, as I say, the damage will not be too bad before the reaction becomes so extreme that people have to drop this Common Core.
Wow. Okay, so we've kind of gone over the standards, we've kind of gone over the flaws. What about the process that you went through? Because that was something I found interesting as far as, you know, the lack of transparency. You know, were you fighting? It sounds almost like from your description that you were actually fighting to improve the standards, and they didn't want to even add algebra. I mean, these kind of things. It's kind of crazy to hear.
Yeah, what I said was accurate. And as I say, there was a real difference of opinion between Phil Darrow and the other two lead authors on the writing team, both of whom wanted to put as much mathematics in there as they could. But Phil Darrow had headed up a commission that had looked at the problem of what what is the minimal amount of math that students need to successfully enter college. And they came up, they're the ones that came up with this sort of amazing result that all these students need is Algebra 1. And, you know, and I had, of course, I had no idea that any of this was going on. And so I was reacting when I saw this Algebra 1. I didn't know what the basis behind it was. All I knew was that this wasn't going to work for the majority of people, and I figured all that we needed to do was to pressure the writing team because validation had that authority, and then it would all get itself fixed. But that didn't happen, and the reason it didn't happen was that this is totally deliberate. That there were people very high up in the process, well beyond any of us, who had already decided that the students that this report that Phil Darrow had been involved with was exactly where they wanted to go. More recently, I read the report, and the report said we are talking strictly about community colleges.
Wow.
And even there, Algebra 1 is absolutely minimal.
So did you have to sign a confidentiality agreement too?
I can't talk about anything that actually went on in validation, but at this point I'm sufficiently annoyed that I am willing to talk about things that went on in other areas of the development of Common Core, but I can't talk about what went on in validation.
Wow. Can you just briefly explain the change in geometry? I actually saw a I think it was a second grade paper the other day, and the parent couldn't figure it out, and it was just flipping like if you had a half moon, you flip it over, and I was like, this looks like geometry, but I'm not sure. And I had a math teacher point out, oh, this is that rigid geometry coming from Common Core. And so I think that anybody who's gone through Euclidean geometry, you know, maybe you can explain what the difference is and why this might be a big problem.
Yeah, well, there's something called axiomatics, and there are certain basic logical problems with pushing too hard on what's called axiomatics. So when you get into the serious level of mathematics that a professional mathematician might be involved in, we cannot be terribly impressed by Euclid's axioms, for example. because there's always a limitation on what you can do with axiomatics. So in a certain sense, in a sense that's very advanced, axiomatic systems are never actually rigorous, and so there's a lot of misinterpretation of that, and so people felt that that Euclid's axioms were inappropriate, and they there were lots of discussion about things like failure of axiomatics and so forth by people who literally had no idea what this was all about. And so they looked around for other methods of doing geometry, and they found these so-called rigid motions. And what they did with the rigid motions back 20 years ago in California was to drop all proofs and to simply use the rigid motions to give students some ideas about what geometry looked like. But it's a very delicate thing, and you can do this. You can make. See, are you there?
Well, can you tell me, has it been successful anywhere? Because that's part of the problem that I'm hearing about.
No, it has not.
Oh.
It has not. In fact, something very like this was tried in Russia back about 40 years ago. And it lasted, and at that time this was the USSR, and so when they did it in there, they did it whole hog. Every single student in the USSR, every single teacher where did they start geometry? End of 6th grade, then 7th grade, a little bit in 8th grade. Then every single teacher, every single student had to teach a rigorous course in geometry, but based on rigid motions. Now, that's far beyond what normally would have been done even 20 years ago now when we were talking about rigid motions. And it lasted for 2 years, and then it was gone, because the outpouring was so great that this was just absurd. Student couldn't do it, teachers couldn't teach it.
Oh boy, we're believe it or not, we're almost to the end of the half hour. I think what you're doing is you're raising a big alarm on these math standards, and anybody who's watching this really needs to take a look at what's being done in their schools right now. I want to kind of jump to Jamie real quick just to identify the differences as far as what they did in Massachusetts, real briefly, because I got to wrap this up. But if you can just kind of identify what's he saying compared to what.
Well, I mean, of course, your viewers really get a clear sense of why we wanted to lean on the academic expertise in mathematics of Professor Milgram. He is the best. The fact is that there are very few academic mathematicians that also know a great deal about K-12 education standards. He is one of the few, and he's probably the finest, and he's a mathematician with international renown. Dr. Stotsky, when she worked on the standards in Massachusetts, also relied on Wilfred Schmidt at Harvard University. And I think that the whole outlook that they were trying to do, both in California and Massachusetts, was to elevate the academic quality of mathematics while doing it in a developmentally appropriate manner. And what you see is that people across the political spectrum, across the intellectual spectrum, have recognized that Massachusetts and California had the best math standards. And so that's why it's really tragic that after, frankly, decades of fighting these battles over math, that states had done it and can do it, but they need to rely on the expertise of real mathematicians.
Okay, we're out of time. Dr. Milgram, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Your input is just so valuable for anybody who's watching. Thank you for taking your time. Jamie, thank you for your input on this. Read Dr. Milgram's credentials. You really need to look at what he has done. And they chose him. They chose Dr. Stotsky to sit on this validation committee. Go look at that. And these two are saying no, that these are not good enough for our kids. And he identifies the many problems with them. Sign the petition. But more importantly, the next show we're going to do is on the English language arts, and Dr. Stotsky is going to come back and she's going to talk about basically the same thing that Dr. Milgram did, and kind of go through where the flaws are, why these are not good enough for our students in our schools. So please stay tuned, and if you didn't watch episode number 1, go back and watch that one so you can catch up on the big picture of Common Core. But thanks for tuning in.